This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome into another edition of the Bartholomew Town Podcast. It's Bill Bartholomew here with you. Hopefully you are all dug out from the storm and enjoyed the storm for what it was on Saturday, right? Didn't get stuck or anything like that. Thanks to all of you that were following along with my storm coverage. It was pretty cold, man. I gotta say, I was out there at one point I was out for like 5-10 minutes doing a video, and like my hands were, I was like, I don't think I can hold my phone anymore. This may have to come to a rapid conclusion. And it did, as a matter of fact. But thanks to all of you, again, who were following along either on social media or on WPRO. And we made it through it. Here we go. Today on the podcast, though, an issue that, I mean, let's be honest about it. This is one that's been percolating in many different senses for arguably decades, right? And as we head towards the meat of the 2022 General Assembly session and take a look at the proposed budget from Governor McKee, it's pretty clear we are finally moving towards recreational cannabis here in Rhode Island, catching up with our neighbors and, frankly, common sense. And there's so many elements to this conversation to look at, so much nuance. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of confusion about certain areas and certain aspects. So we're going to take some time in 2022 to break it all down. And joining us today are doctors Iannuccilli and Jonathan Martin from PureVita Labs for a discussion primarily on analytical testing of cannabis products. This is something that is, again, it's like when you're not focused on the core issues and the elements of this broad conversation around cannabis, you don't even probably think about it. But the regulatory structure and just the process by which cannabis products are tested and then presented to the consumer is a bit of a wild, wild west scenario. And PureVita Labs have, through a number of processes, developed their analytical testing format and are here today to kind of explain best practices for the presentation of cannabis products to the general public. So this is core stuff. So whether you're listening to this as somebody who is kind of more informed on the area of cannabis, if you have no clue, if you're a lawmaker, if you're somebody in private industry, if you're a physician, if you're an educator, whatever it may be, this is all relevant. It's happening now, and we're fortunate to have the doctors here to kind of break things down. Remember, if you want to support the independent journalism, entertainment, opinion, and analysis that B-Town has become known for, well, you can do so for $3 per month by heading to patreon.com/BartholomewTown. You'll also receive exclusive content by becoming a B-Town insider. That's patreon.com/BartholomewTown.
So I'm Dr. Iannuccilli.
Dr. Jonathan Martin.
We're actually two physicians that are Rhode Island natives who were exposed to several questions from patients of ours about medicinal cannabis. And over the years, we really didn't know what to tell them. I mean, there wasn't a lot of information out there. It's not something that's taught to us in medical school. So we really started looking into the industry. We figured out that, there are some major issues with the way that medicinal cannabis markets have sort of evolved. The products that are out there are, in most cases, grossly mislabeled. In fact, up to 70% of products bear inaccurate labels where, the amount of THC in there is often mislabeled. There are certain other cannabinoids that you may want to know about that you may or may not see on the label. So in order to use these substances in a medicinal sense, we really realized that, you got to get these labels right first. These products have to be accurately labeled for people to know how to use them within their dose range, similar to the way that, even people self-medicate with alcohol now. Without percent alcohol by volume rating on these drinks. I mean, most people know how many beers they can have before they're, they shouldn't drive, or, that type of a thing with cannabis is sort of lacking. So we sort of approach this industry in a way like, how can we better the labels on these products? How can we make this more prescriptive and directive for patients? And we realize that it all starts with the labs and the processes. So your question was, why is it that cannabis and hemp really needs to be tested? I'll let John kind of chime in here a little bit, and
I think it's important to note first where we are in the state of Rhode Island. So PureVita goes back about 5 years. We took years to get the project up and going, and we've been open for about going on 7 months now. And so in the state of Rhode Island, there is testing for medical cannabis that's going out the door. The regulations were complete and have been made available to the public since late 2019. The question is enforcement. They're not entirely enforced right now, but they're moving in that direction. We've been working closely with the state to make sure that we get all the tests up and going that are appropriate at the appropriate times in order to not bottleneck the market and make sure that we're getting as safe a product out onto the shelves as possible. So we are operational. There is testing. It's on any flower inflorescence of cannabis that you might buy at a dispensary. Tinctures and vaporizer cartridges, things like that are tested for a certain number of things. Not all of the tests that are listed in the regulations are currently enforced, but the majority of them are. And as Jay was saying, we came into this because as practicing physicians, we come across on a daily basis people who are interested in using cannabis because they get either fed up with the allopathic medicines that are available to them, the side effects from them. There's just an intellectual curiosity out there about whether or not cannabis could be helpful for certain ailments. And when you go and do a really thorough literature search, there's very little information, very little real information about what types of cannabis would be helpful for which ailments, and how would you actually go about offering that to a patient with some comfort level on safety. And that's where we decided that, for Rhode Island, this is something that really needs to be done well and done properly. So that's why we got into this. And we've been plugging along. And we do feel like we've made an impact so far. And we do feel like the products that are on the shelves today are safer than they were, 2 years ago when there was absolutely zero testing going on.
Yeah, and
Right.
it's as simple as, is there mold in the product and things of that sort. But then, as you mentioned, of course, the analytical side of it, there's the kind of generic version of that, which is it indica? Is it sativa? Is it a hybrid? And that impacts people in a significantly different manner. But then, of course, the cannabinoids and particularly THC level inside products, that's something that it certainly impacts the experience of that medicine. And you're suggesting that there's a lot, even in our medical dispensaries, that there's the discrepancy between what a true analytical test would reveal and what the labels are actually saying on the bottles or the bags or however it's being distributed?
Rhode Island, I think, is actually doing a better job of having accurate labels than other states are currently. And you can go through and look up instances, Nevada, Michigan, Oregon, California, where there were recalls of products based on mislabeled products. And I think we're doing a much better job actually in Rhode Island of being accurate on our labels. I think we need to get more labels onto more products, but in general, they are accurate labels. The THC thing that you mentioned and all the cannabinoids and indica and sativa, those get to the core of what we're talking about here. You can call a rose by any other rose would smell as sweet. So the name itself doesn't much matter. And in fact, the dichotomy of indica and sativa may not matter as much as we all think it does. What really matters is the molecular composition of the plant material, the number of cannabinoids, the ratios of those cannabinoids, and then the terpenes that are also found in that material. And one example or one sort of analogy I like to use for people, if you're familiar with a manual transmission, which a lot of people might not be these days, but I view THC as sort of the gas pedal, while CBD and the other cannabinoids, non-THC cannabinoids, are the clutch. And then the terpenes that are found in the material are almost like the trim of the car. And that's the entire experience you might get from a specific strain of cannabis versus another. And they call that the entourage effect. And that has everything to do with how your brain and your organs interact with these molecules in concert together.
Right.
In our current market here in Rhode Island specifically, Governor McKee's budget includes, or his request, I should say, includes marijuana legalization. There's still some skeptics out there on this issue, and it's an interesting it's not necessarily a certain type of person or a certain type of experience growing up or anything like that. Across the board, there are skeptics, and it's classified as a Schedule I controlled substance on the federal level. How does this get broken down where people are, by and large, able to understand the medicinal benefit of cannabis? And also, quite frankly, I don't know your opinion, but just the recreational use of it as well. Like, how does, as an industry player, an industry leader, kind of what's your feeling on all of this?
So I would say that, regardless of whether or not you're looking at cannabis in a sort of quote unquote medicinal sense or an adult use sort of recreational sense, most people use it for a purpose. So in that sense, I would consider the indications to almost be one and the same. We have the same goals in the industry. You want to present the consumer with a product that is as consistently manufactured as possible, that has an accurate label, so that when someone learns their own individual sensitivity, they learn their sort of profile, if you will, of entourage effect with a given strain that gives them a certain experience. You want the consumer to be able to go back and get that same predictable experience, to be able to use cannabis in the same way that, say, a medication would be used, or even the same way that someone would use alcohol, say, for stress relief. So it is very, very important, regardless of whether or not you're talking about recreational or medicinal cannabis, to make sure that the label is accurate. That's the starting point.
And as far as the Schedule I nature of cannabis currently, there are 36 or 37 markets in the United States right now that have some form of legalized cannabis or decriminalized cannabis, whether it's medicinal or recreational. And it gets to the core of the states being able to do what they feel is right for their constituencies versus the federal government, and what are the reasonings behind this. And I think there's a tremendous amount that you could read about why cannabis is classified as a Schedule I medication, whether it's got something to do with controlling hemp production in the United States, or whether it has something to do with, not wanting pacifists as citizens and thinking that it would derail the war efforts in the 1940s. There's a lot of reasons why it's sort of just been stuck there. And it's unfortunate because there's also a lot of evidence that it is a very helpful plant on the medicinal side of things. So I think that Schedule I, the first step is to have that descheduled and get that probably down either into a lower tier or off the FDA's schedule at all. And once that's done, then laws will have to be created to allow for interstate transport and interstate commerce, interstate testing. Right now, we're operating in 37 small markets, which on some levels is good for people like us. It allows a microcosm to operate in and to bring creative ideas and start small businesses in a market where it's okay to do. On another level, it's unfortunate because there's not a lot of people doing research on it still. It's difficult to get federal money to fund research. And there are, institutions that are nervous about doing any cannabis research because they feel it may compromise their ability to get federal funding in the future.
Yeah, it's a wild time. There's no question about it. And it's going to be interesting to look back on this period of transition in the future as sort of like a major intersection culturally, scientifically, and just, I think, in general with the political aspects of all of this. I mean, right now, if you go to one of the recreational dispensaries in Massachusetts in Fall River and drive back to East Providence, technically you're committing a crime by crossing the border with a product you just legally bought. It's interesting. I've talked to state troopers about this issue, and it's like, what are they going to do? Let's get real here. I mean, it's also just catching up with reality as well when you talk about descheduling. For daily coverage of all things Rhode Island and beyond, be sure to follow me on social media at Bill Bartholomew on Twitter, and you can find me on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook.
Now back to B-Town.
California's moved to standardize its testing. What standards for medical cannabis has PureVita Labs helped to develop here in Rhode Island?
Well, I think first off, if you allow me just to digress for 1 second, because there is one important point that I want to add to that last question there. You mentioned the whole perspective of this being Schedule 1 controlled substance. I mean, I do believe that a lot of people's sort of mindset of cannabis is influenced by whatever exposure or experience they may have had with the substance, several years ago, back before it sort of became mainstream like it is now. And I will tell you that as of about 6 years ago, I was one of those people that looked at medicinal cannabis and said, you know what, like, how could this possibly be a medicine? I mean, this is just like, I can understand how people could use it for pain relief and feel good on it, but I just didn't understand how it could be used as a medication. It's all about perspective. I mean, the thing that has changed in the industry from before, when, the standard method of consumption was grinding up dried flower, rolling it up in a joint, or smoking it in a pipe, you really had no idea, first of all, what was in the product content-wise, how strong it was. You also didn't know how much you were actually taking in. Now we have product formulations and precision manufacturing where we've got extracts and concentrates, and they're really homogeneous mixtures of this substance so that, you can actually control and almost microdose the amount of THC you get to stay within a therapeutic range. And I think that is where we're at now with medicinal potential. And that is what I would say to people that are doubters that, look, like, there is a lot of evidence out there of the medicinal benefits of cannabinoids, phytocannabinoids in humans. It has been largely suppressed. I mean, a lot of that is political, but the reality is the information is there. And now we've got the technology to dose the stuff appropriately. So if we get this regulatory framework, up and running and perfect, then there's no reason why cannabis could not really compete with alcohol as being sort of the better, sort of safer way to manage stress and self-medicate for all the reasons that people use alcohol. So that's what I wanted to add to that last question there. And again, just remind me of the last question that you asked before I interrupted. I apologize.
Oh, no problem. And that's a great point. I think it's critical and central to this entire conversation. Just in terms of California, they've moved to standardize their testing. Right. Is that the right move? And what standards for medical cannabis has PureVita Labs helped to develop here in Rhode Island?
Yep. So, when we started putting together the concept for this lab, our goal was, look, we want to build a sort of hospital grade facility that, if and when the federal government decides to legalize this, that we have a platform in place that sort of like would be considered FDA compliant and sort of meets all the criteria for a government sanctioned grade lab to do regulatory testing on cannabis and hemp. So, when you look at, the way the industry is structured now,
California has been standardized, I think, for a bit of time now.
Yeah.
You go out, I don't know if you've ever been out to a California dispensary, but when you walk in there, it looks like this is a market that's been around for 100 years. Mm-hmm. And, things are put together well. The labels are all visible. Whether or not they're all accurate, it's a different story, but I think they're getting more accurate as the days go on. And certainly the West Coast was one of the markets that we looked at when we wanted to craft the Rhode Island regulations. And we did our best we went to public comment a number of times. We did our best to work directly with the Department of Health and the Department of Business Regulation. And our goal when these regulations were being crafted in Rhode Island was to create the highest bar that you could pass to try to get Rhode Island into that top position. We love, Rhode Islanders love to talk about where we fall on the lists, and oftentimes we fall down toward the bottom of the list. We really thought that this was an opportunity where we could get Rhode Island at the top of a list by setting very strict standards for the safety of these products, such that physicians like ourselves would be comfortable with our patients consuming them, such that you would be comfortable with your family members consuming them, and such that we can get some accurate information out of them so that we can push the science forward and make sure that it's not just, taking these pre-rolled materials, these marijuana cigarettes or joints, and smoking them until the end, not knowing what you've ingested, how much you've ingested, or what the effect is going to be, and sitting around and waiting for 20 minutes to find out. It can be a much more prescriptive and accurate sort of experience where there's good science and understanding behind the compounds that are there. So the current regulations that are in Rhode Island are well done to create standards across the labs, and they're well done to make sure that we get all of the accurate information we need to out of these so that we can provide a better environment for cannabis use for everybody.
Yep. And I would add, so one major thing that Rhode Island does that is a huge step in the right direction. And, it's sort of learning from the mistakes of the more advanced markets on the West Coast. There are several ways that labs operate in the regulatory space. The sample that is taken from a regulatory sized batch of, say, dried flower, cannabis flower. In Rhode Island, a full batch is 10 pounds. It cannot exceed 10 pounds. But if you harvest all the flower from a cannabis plant, you have varying degrees of potency and cannabinoid content in these flowers, depending on how close they were to the light source. So when you mix them all together, you have a very sort of heterogeneous mixture of dried flower there. There is a method to going in and statistically sampling this batch to get a representative sample of the entire batch that you should put on the label for that product. That does require science. And Rhode Island has required that the labs and the scientists actually go out to the facilities where the product has been harvested and batched, do the regulatory sampling on the premises to get a representative sample to then bring back to the lab to process. And that does actually result in a much more accurate label. The reason is that, in some states where cultivators are allowed to sort of drop a sample off to the lab, there is a tendency to, because the price of marijuana is influenced by the THC potency, which is another problem we could spend hours talking about, there's an incentive for cultivators to want the highest potency THC listed on their labels. So there's a practice called hero sampling where they will literally pluck the apical bud off the plant, the one that is theoretically the most potent, drop that off at the lab and say, this is representative of the entire production batch. And what happens is that you end up with a label that has artificially inflated levels of THC on that label. You can see that often in markets that do sort of allow labs to drop samples off. Like in Massachusetts, you'll notice that some of the products, when you look at the dose, it says up to 5 milligrams on an edible. What does that mean? What's the standard of error here? I mean, is this a 2 milligram? Is this a 5 milligram? That can be the difference between feeling something and nothing at all. And when you have to wait, 30 minutes to an hour for an effect to kick in, that can be very difficult for a user to try to gauge whether or not this was a 5 milligram dose, or should I wait longer? Should I take another one? You can see where the experience can change because of the inaccuracies of the label. So the fact that the lab goes out and does the sampling in Rhode Island, we get a representative sample of that batch and we bring it back and we process it according to best scientific technique. That is a step in a huge direction of more accurate labels downstream.
Really, really interesting stuff. You're right. We could go on for in fact, I'd love to have you guys back on down the line here later this year to keep this conversation going, because I think it's so important. I mean, let's be honest about it. So many people, you couldn't put an actual accurate poll because so many people are consuming cannabis in Rhode Island, either via legitimate medical cards, kind of quote unquote fudged medical cards, which, you've got some of these wild doctors that, they don't even see in person. They do a telehealth visit and, I've got anxiety. Okay, whatever. That's going on. Obviously, people crossing the border. There's still a black market economy here. And people are, I think so devoid of everything you're talking about in terms of knowledge of, you still see people on the streets of Providence walking around smoking blunts, and you're thinking to yourself, man, what is going on here?
Right.
There's nothing medically sound about inhaling a full cigar, number one, but that perception and that experience from a user perspective is so off right now. And there's a way to turn that into something that's really productive for humankind. Just in exactly what you're talking about, understanding what the product is. Last couple of minutes here. From a cultivator's perspective, I guess kind of summing it up, what should cultivators do to form a product and a relationship with a testing operation such as yours that is fluid and so they can be prepared to evolve in this space when standardization across the board, recreational, medical, et cetera, starts to become an ever-present thing here in Rhode Island and across the country.
So, it's interesting that the cultivators are actually in a better position than I think even the analytic labs or the physicians are in terms of where their science has gone over the past 20 years. And so there's a tremendous amount of literature in plant biology that's focused on cannabis and hemp production. So the cultivators have been able to, look at the science of par levels and lighting and nutrients and all these other things and to try to make, the best product that they can. I think now that the appetite for legalized cannabis is growing in all the states, it's growing federally, and these standards are coming about, there's certainly some shape shifting of the cultivators' processes that has to occur to make sure that they are compliant and getting ready for all these things. And perhaps some of them are going to find out that they can't be using certain chemicals in the plants. But for the most part, I think in Rhode Island, we've found that the vast majority of cultivators that are operating here are operating at a level that is beyond necessary for the regulations that are currently in place. So you've got some pretty good players in Rhode Island right now. I think to get ready for us, as we've got, currently we're serving a plurality of this state in terms of cultivators and dispensaries. But getting people more on board with wanting to have the cleanest product out there, and more importantly, wanting to have a consistent product on the shelf over and over and over again. As Jay points out, you wouldn't buy a 6-pack of beer if you didn't know that each beer there was consistent. It was the same alcohol per volume. It had the same taste and texture and all these things. If it was a crapshoot, people would stay away from it. You can put all the fancy marketing materials all over it, but people will start to realize that inconsistent products will not bring them back. So consistency of product, consistency of manufacturing is hugely important. And it really comes down to working with a laboratory that's going to give you good information back, accurate information back, and then even go out and help when there are problems. And we've been in those situations where cultivator can't figure out where certain level of contamination is coming from, and we can overlook their grows and see if we can help them find where these things are coming from. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship, and all of it benefits the consumer that's walking out the door, hopefully with a safe product, and are going to ingest it in a responsible manner. As far as, seeing people with a blunt walking down the street, I don't disagree with you. It doesn't make sense, especially inhaled plant material is certainly the least healthy method of consumption. However, it's one of the best methods of consumption of any medicine we know, because the lungs have such a large surface area. The question is, can you deliver medicine through the lung tissue without actually using combusted plant material? And I think the market's moving toward more acceptance of vaporizers and concentrates and things like that. But then you get the stories of the vape crisis that occurred about 2 years ago, where vitamin E acetate was being used as a cutting agent. And so that's a perfect example of why it's so important to not buy these sorts of products on the black market, because you may wind up in an ICU somewhere intubated, and they'll be calling Dr. Iannuccilli to try and pull a clot out of you somewhere. So there is a major move away from flower and toward these concentrates, but there's a major need for appropriate testing and purchasing those products on the white market and not the black market.
Yeah.
So, and I'd like just two concluding points here to echo what John was saying. I mean, labs right now, they shouldn't look at themselves as just a simple pass-through testing service. I mean, I believe now the purpose of a cannabis testing lab is to work with the industry, to work with the cultivators, to help them understand when they do fail a certain test, what the source of contamination may be, so that they can remediate it. Branding is very, very important. As we work now within siloed markets in each individual state, there are competitive advantages to just having a license. You don't really even need to build a brand. People are just excited at the opportunity to be able to buy this stuff on a recreational basis. But when you take down those boundaries between states, if this goes federally legal, now, you're going to have distribution in cultivation in major areas, and then you're going to have just retail outlets. So you've got to actually create a product that is brand worthy, that attracts a loyal following. I mean, look, a Big Mac, at McDonald's You walk into any McDonald's in the country, the Big Mac is going to taste the same. They have a brand. They've got a consistent way of producing a product. So we help cultivators in that sense. It's not just a simple pass-fail. The other thing I would mention, just to bring it all back around, we've talked a lot about regulations. The regulations that are written in the state of Rhode Island are very, very, very well crafted. We sort of, made it a point in the beginning to have a lobbyist involved and to actually exert some scientific knowledge there. We have a PhD analytical chemist that is specialized in cannabis testing, which is rare. So he has a unique perspective on, what is needed and what the industry lacks. So the regs in Rhode Island are very well crafted. They have not been yet fully enforced, but we're working closely with the state, as a regulatory lab here to see those rolled out in an efficient way and as rapidly as possible. We want to be able to test for pesticides and all the things in the product that may be in there that could be harmful. So once we get, our platform up and running where it is fully enforced and on a regulatory standpoint, I think that is a major crucial step to the ultimate adult use recreational legalization. We need people to feel safe, to know that products that are legally available are actually safe for them and that they're accurately labeled. And now we've got the makings of a credible market going forward that can actually compete with the black market experience. So, kudos to the people that, had put the regs together. And, look, we've got a challenge ahead of us here. I mean, the DOH, the DBR, there's some really talented people there. And, we're working in a new industry here to roll out a regulatory platform that should be exemplary to other states in the region. So, everyone just, be patient, but we are going to get there. We're going to get there, probably within the next 6 months. The products in Rhode Island will be far superior to other products that are offered in other neighboring state markets. Yeah.
And that's a great response to the critics who have been, in terms of revenue generation and in terms of legal policy, arguing that Rhode Island is, we're so far behind Massachusetts. We're so far behind the rest of the region. Here's a chance for Rhode Island to lead in this space. And it starts in organizations like yours. So thanks so much for that contribution to our society here as a whole, because it's critical. I mean, this is happening. It's going to continue to evolve. And if there's not standardized best practices, it's just going to be a legal wild, wild west, as we sort of described in this episode. So PureVita Labs, thank you so much, doctors. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Rhode Island's podcast of record, B-Town.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.